Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is Leslie Manning from Bath. Leslie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Good to have you here. Tell us about yourself. What do you do for a living?
Well, I am an advocate for economic and social justice. I work now as a consultant working with faith-based community organizing for a group called PICO Network, People Improving Their Communities Through Organizing. But I have a lifetime of organizing. I've been a union organizer. I've worked with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. I've worked with the Service Employees International Union. I worked here in Maine as a union representative for the state workers and was also employed as a deputy at the Department of Labor under the previous administration.
All right, so you know the jobs issue pretty well then.
Yeah, I'd like to think I do. It's a tough thing to get a handle on in this economy, but I think part of the reason that I'm here today is to talk about our economic priorities.
Yes. You're also a Quaker. Tell us about what that means.
Well, to me, being a Quaker, a member of the Religious Society of Friends, means that I have to walk the talk. Our values as Quakers are integrity, peace, community, equality, and simplicity. When you mix that up, you get spice: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. But I think the other major piece, the S that we add at the end, is service. Our motto, if we have one, is let your life speak. And if my life is speaking, what does it say about me?
Very nice. You also belong to an organization that was recently created in Bath called the Midcoast Citizens for Sustainable Economies. Tell us about that group.
Well, that's a real grassroots group that grew up in Bath fairly recently, last fall, when Bath Iron Works, which is a subsidiary, as many people know, of General Dynamics, a large multi-million-dollar corporation and defense contractor, requested a tax property decrease for doing improvements that are a necessary part of their business model. The city was willing to grant this TIF, this tax reduction, this property tax reduction, at the same time that we had a referendum on the ballot about improving the physical plant of our schools. And it was such a stark contrast to me that the city was willing to award a multi-million-dollar corporation millions of dollars in tax breaks when we could not afford to put a roof on the schools where our children are being educated, and that we had to go to the taxpayers and ask for extra spending on that. What kind of sense does that make? So this group of citizens formed and had a conversation with the community, and then went to the city council, presented their case, and had the amount of money that was going to be reduced limited, and saved the taxpayers of Bath $3 million. You know, that's how things should work in Maine. We're a community, we're a state that still basically relies on the town meeting form of government. And what my experience has been is if you sit down and you listen to what your neighbors are concerned about, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, you can often find common ground. So it's on the basis of that that Midcoast Citizens for Sustainable Economies was created. We want, among other things, to look at our states, our areas' over-reliance on defense contracting. I don't know if most people in your viewership know this, but almost 10% of our state's GDP is dependent on defense contracting. And military contracting is a portion of every state's economy. But for a lot of states, it's 3%, it's 4%. Ours is as large as the state of Virginia's, where the Pentagon itself is located. And at a time when our elected representatives from all parties are having discussions about budget priorities and reauthorization of defense spending, it's really time for us to be planful and mindful about how much of Maine's economy is dependent on defense contracting, and are there ways to plan for that transition?
Across Maine, can you give a few illustrations besides Bath Iron Works where that money is spent?
Sure, I'm happy to. You know, we often think of defense contractors as the armaments and the uniforms, and that certainly is the case. In the case of BIW, it's naval destroyers. Now, there's an interesting name, isn't there? What? Destroyers. More importantly, we provide additional services. Maine, for example, in Martins Point Healthcare, has a major contract for the delivery of healthcare services for military families and retirees. Martins Point is a well-respected medical practice that holds a multi-million-dollar contract with the Defense Department. We all know that New Balance shoes recently received contracts to make military footwear. But how many of us know that there is a corporation that's been set up with the Passamaquoddy people to do the sewing and the construction of apparel and accessories for military uniforms? Those are just some examples. My understanding is that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 defense-reliant businesses and industries here in Maine. And if you think about it geographically, from the ill-named, improperly named Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which is in fact, according to the Supreme Court of the United States, located in Maine, in Kittery, Maine, all the way up to the former Loring Air Force Base, where workers up there refurbish Humvees and other vehicles that are used by the military. We are very reliant here in Maine on defense contracting as a major way of providing good jobs with good benefits so that people can support their families.
One other I'd add is the Pratt Whitney aircraft engine plant down in Sanford that employs quite a few people.
Exactly. And, you know, as a former union organizer and representative, I think it's very important that people find work that enables them to support their families. When a kid in Maine graduates from high school and can't afford to go to college, what choices does that kid have, male or female? McDonald's? Dealing drugs? The military? You know, you used to be able to graduate from high school and go to a mill and make a good middle-class living where you could support your family. Unfortunately, over the last 20, 25 years, most of those jobs are gone. Most of those jobs are gone, and we're fighting hard to keep the ones that remain.
Well, you know, the Pentagon's been saying for a few years now, back to the Bush administration when Secretary of Defense was Donald Rumsfeld. I saw a presentation on C-SPAN one day of a guy by the name of Thomas Barnett. He was introduced as Rumsfeld's strategy guy. At that time, he was an instructor at the Naval War College in Rhode Island. And he said that under corporate globalization, every country is going to have a different role. And that in the United States, we're not going to make things anymore. We're not going to have industrial jobs. We're not going to make TVs, shoes, refrigerators, things like that. That our role will be security export. We're going to make weapons. We're going to wage war on behalf of the corporations for resource extraction around the world. And that seems to be what's happening today. That really, as you say, there are few other games in town other than military production.
And how did that decision get made? And who's responsible and who's accountable? This is a country that has long held that we need to have civilian oversight of the military. And when people go into back rooms and cut deals with multi-million-dollar corporations so that they can be seen as quote unquote job creators. And then we become reliant on that stream of jobs. Who gets to make those decisions? Who
You answer that question.
Well, I think we pretty much have answered it. Who's doing the deals? We're back at the place that General and then President Eisenhower warned us about. You know, the man who had lived through war himself was very prescient in his foretelling of how significant the military-industrial complex would become if we allowed it to go unchecked. And it is our responsibility as citizens, and certainly as parents and grandparents, to think about the unchecked power of the military and the corporations that dominate the military as we move forward. That's a big subject. That's a big thing to take on. So we've got to do it in pieces. And the first piece is, what does Maine's economy look like? And what can we, knowing that these cuts are going to come, knowing that politicians are learning to be more courageous in standing up to these interests, with our support, with our help, with our education efforts, because I do believe that they want to do the right thing. You know, I'm a bit of a policy wonk, and I spend a lot of time listening to the debates in the House and the Senate about authorizations, because how we spend our money very much reflects what our priorities and values are. And if you listen to the defense authorization discussion that was recently held in the House,
in Washington,
politicians of both sides were saying, guess what, it's time to audit the Pentagon. That,
it's never
although
happened.
required by law, has never happened.
Yeah.
It's time to cut back on wasteful spending. Everyone agrees we need responsible defense. That isn't the issue. But there's a world of difference between a Coast Guard and a Coast Guard cutter and a Navy destroyer that is designed to be an intelligence gathering and offensive weapon.
Yeah.
Where do we get to participate in this discussion? Where do we get to vote on how the government spends our money? If almost half of every dollar that I pay in taxes is going to support war, where do I get to say I don't want that to happen?
Yeah. Getting back to this group, Mid-Coast Citizens for Sustainable Economies in Bath, it's organizing a public forum on June 27th. Talk about what this event is and why people should consider coming to it.
Well, Mid-Coast Citizens for Sustainable Economies is a group of local people, church leaders and labor leaders, working class people, retirees, people who have a real concern about sustainable living and sustainable jobs in our communities. And we've organized a discussion around Maine's over-reliance on defense and what some other states and municipalities are doing about creating plans for the retrenchment that we think is going to happen. For example,
Well, before you go into that, let's talk about when and where.
this is going to be Friday, June 27th at the Winter Street Church in Bath. We're going to have this in conjunction with Vital Connections, which is a neighborhood and community-based group in the Mid-Coast area that brings in, topics of interest to the community in community forums. So it'll open with a potluck at 5:30, and then the discussion will be held at 6:30. And one of the people that we've invited to speak is a woman named Miriam Pemberton, who has done a significant amount of work about how we prepare for the defense transition. And she has worked with a number of other states, including, I understand, Michigan and Connecticut, and really wants us to start to be thinking proactively rather than just reacting to these
Right.
cuts when they happen.
Yeah, whoever thought the Navy base in Brunswick was going to close, right? And whoever thought that the conditions of our economy might be such that it requires that we don't build so many destroyers at Bath Iron Works. Whoever would have thunk that that was a possibility, right? So what do we do now? Well, as you say, we want to get out in front of that train.
And we want to really have this discussion now during an election year. I mean, one of the things that happens in campaigns, supposedly, is that we talk about issues, we talk about priorities, and we talk about our plans for the future. So that at a time when Maine is having a discussion about what the next 4 or 8 years looks like, at a time when our country is supposedly ending 2 wars and retrenching its foreign and domestic policy, its foreign and domestic spending, what better time to have a conversation with our candidates for the United States Senate, with our candidates for governor, and even with our candidates for the state legislature about spending and economic priorities and about job creation, because ultimately this is what this is about. One of the defenses used about Pentagon spending is that it creates jobs. And the irony is that it is the least efficient way to create jobs of all of the systems that are available to us.
Now, why would that be?
Because it's capital intensive.
What does that mean?
That means that you spend a lot of money up front to employ a relatively few number of workers. For example, if you were to take the same amount, say for every 100 jobs created by the Pentagon, all right, or by Pentagon spending, if you were to invest that money in healthcare, you'd get 168 jobs. So the return on investment in healthcare is significantly greater. If you were to spend the same amount of money that creates 100 jobs at the Pentagon, you would create almost 150 jobs in clean energy. And most importantly, perhaps to our future, if you were to take the same amount of money to create 100 jobs at the Pentagon, you could create 251 jobs in education. And we're a state that is committed to lifelong learning. We have said that education matters from preschool, early intervention programs, all the way through senior college, through the community college system, through the state university system, in our high schools. We have said that education is a priority for us. It's how we're going to move ourselves from 48th place in job creation further up the ladder. We're going to do it with education. Then why aren't we investing in education? Why hasn't the federal government honored its promise to subsidize 55% of education spending for special needs students? When they created those programs, they said, we will fund them at 55%, and yet they've never done it. Yeah. And the reason they haven't is because we're spending money on defense and not spending it here at home.
The University of Massachusetts at Amherst has done a series of studies on this very topic. And one of the things they say is that if we were to build rail systems at a place like BIW, we would double the number of jobs that we're getting now. As you say, that in every case, you get more jobs when you put the money into doing something else. Well, if we built rail, something that would help us deal with the coming reality of climate change, we would double the number of jobs. Imagine that. Well, I want to ask you about Connecticut. Connecticut recently, last year, passed a planning commission around this whole idea of conversion or diversification. Talk about that. Explain what that is about and why that would be good for Maine.
Well, Connecticut also is very reliant on defense spending. The submarines that are repaired in Kittery are actually built in Groton, Connecticut at Electric Boat, which is also owned, by the way, by General Dynamics. And one of the things that Connecticut did is look at its dependence, its over-reliance, and say, how do we bring all the stakeholders to the table and have a discussion about what we know is inevitable? The Pentagon budget is going to shrink. As a result, there will be economic dislocation. How do we plan for that, and how do we transfer the skills of this very skilled workforce? I mean, what is BIW's claim to fame? That they are some of the greatest metal fabricators in the world. that they can do things that nobody else possibly in the world can do, that their skills, that their abilities are eminently transferable, as you suggest, to other industries and other lines of work.
And we know that, just to interrupt for a second, a couple of years ago, one of the workers at Bath Iron Works created a petition and circulated it amongst the workers, and he got 800 signatures saying, we want to build wind turbines. So clearly there, within the workforce at Bath Iron Works, there's a will to work on something else besides warships.
And I think they see the economic folly in being dependent on only one source. And General Dynamics has basically indicated that they want to be a sole source contractor. And that is not good for the workers, that's not good for the community, and ultimately it's not good for the rest of us. So the question is, how do we have a discussion as a state and as a community about what our future looks like? You know, when we're trying to attract and retain good employers to this state, one of the things that we have to offer, and everybody recognizes this, is the willingness of our workforce to learn or retrain for the skills that are needed.
How do you think the unions that represent the workers at BIW would feel about this diversification?
In conversations that some of us have had with union members and with union leadership, we know that they're looking at the same set of facts that we are. And they are beginning to look at options and alternatives. You know, this is not a new discussion. As long ago as 20 years ago, we were having discussions about the so-called peace dividend. We were talking in the 90s about what conversion of military installation and military contracting would look like. So anybody who's been paying attention to revenue streams knows that they also have to look at contingency plans when they're planning for the future. That's essentially what the union is doing. The union's job is to guarantee the best jobs, the safest jobs, the best wages, the best benefits for that membership that they can. And they're doing their job not only in negotiating with their current employer about their current line of business, but also looking at opportunities to grow and to sustain the economy in this area and to support those workers who support their families.
And so shouldn't the community, people like us, people in the peace movement, people in the church community, people in economic development, local politicians, shouldn't we all be having the backs of the unions? Shouldn't we be supporting the unions to ensure that the workers are going to have jobs in the future as these cuts come? Shouldn't we be involved in creating a planning process statewide?
Well, I think that's really where we're coming from. What are the not only what are the short-term interests, but what are the long-term interests? What are the benefits to us as a state and as a community in supporting good jobs for a diverse and highly trained workforce? That job creation and that support for workers is at the heart of what makes us sustainable. When we talk about sustainable economies, we're not just talking about a sustainable planet, as important as that is. We're not just talking about a sustainable community, as important as that is. We're talking about sustainable economies, good jobs for people who are willing to work.
You were the president of the Maine Council of Churches. Are you still, or are you?
No, I've stepped down. I'm the chair, however, of their public policy committee.
Okay, so you're still involved with,
I'm still
with the
very
Maine
involved.
Council of Churches.
Yes.
I wonder, what is the moral imperative here from the church perspective?
Well, you know, the Council of Churches is an association of 9 very diverse denominations. We represent everybody from the Roman Catholics to the Unitarian Universalists. And I, of course, come from a church that is known as one of the traditional peace churches. Church of the Brethren, Mennonites, Quakers. You know, the Methodists used to be a peace church until World War II. And the discussion that we're having in the faith community now is about what loving your neighbor really means. Loving your enemy does not mean you have to like them, but it does mean that we have to be doing things differently than when we disagree, killing people. That's at the heart of all faith traditions. And that's really the conversation I'd love to be having. How do we get away from this idea that when we are in disagreement, the way that we prove ourselves to be right is making the other person wrong, making the other person the other, making the other person our enemy, and using that to justify killing them. We need to be teaching ourselves and our children how to deal with conflict differently. What would this world look like if we were teaching second, third, and fourth graders how to recognize and deal with and resolve conflict so that we're not resorting to this very outdated and immoral means of using our military and economic power to destroy other people?
What about the politicians, the political leaders of Maine? Why are they not, at least I don't hear them talking much about these kind of studies that you referred to earlier that show that military spending is not the best way to create jobs. Why aren't they talking more about that? If doing this kind of diversification conversion is better for the economy, why don't we hear them?
Well, not unlike the unions, what they're interested in is job security. And if they're going to take on some of the biggest and most entrenched lobbyists and special interests in this country, then they need the widespread support of the people. So we've got to have their backs as well. We've got to be challenging our elected representatives to do more than maintain the status quo, because we know that what we're doing now is not working. And we need a new plan, and we need to sit with them. They need to be included in this discussion about what our future and job creation in Maine looks like, because what we're doing now just ain't getting us where we need to be.
So how can we, very quickly with 1 minute left, how can we get those elected officials involved in this discussion?
I think there is a great deal of interest in having a common discussion along the lines of a commission like the Maine Citizens Fair Trade Commission. That grew out of the NAFTA. You know, Maine lost more jobs in NAFTA than any other state, and we were backpedaling, we were scrambling, we were reacting. What we need to do now is to get ahead of this. We know this is coming. We need to get ahead of it and invite the economists and the job creators and the unions and the politicians and the people to sit down together and come up with a plan. When we do that, it works.
Thank you very much, Leslie. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Bruce.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you
Your
for
very
yours.
important work for a long time. And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.